What I'm going to talk about is something a little bit different. This is not my main research area. My main research area is multi-agent systems. That's about AI systems talking to one another. So normally at an academic conference, that's what I would be speaking about. I would be speaking about how we build AI systems that can communicate and cooperate and coordinate with one another. But since AI has become such a big thing over the last few years, I've increasingly been asked, given my experience over the last 30 years with artificial intelligence, to talk about where I think AI is taking the world and where I think AI is taking society. So in this talk, what I'm going to do is I'm going to speculate a little bit about some ways in which artificial intelligence is going to affect us directly, how regular people will see artificial intelligence in their lives and how it's going to change society. So the first thing I want to say is that when I talk to the general public about AI, they often have misconceptions about the kind of AI that I'm talking about. And what they tend to assume that AI is about, and what recent developments in AI are all about, is what's sometimes called general AI. So general AI is the AI of Hollywood. It's about building machines that have the kinds of capabilities that human beings have for intelligent action, machines that have the full range of intellectual capabilities that human beings have. And so this goes with the ideas of, for example, conscious machines and self-awareness and human level intelligence. And we sometimes hear about the singularity. Okay, so while many people in the general public are concerned about that version of AI, that's not the version of AI that I think we're going to see in the next 30 years. It's up for debate whether or not we will see it at some point after that. But where the action is in contemporary AI is about getting machines to do very specific tasks which currently require brains and potentially nervous systems and bodies. Brains, either human brains or animal brains. And particularly narrow AI, where it's made great progress recently, is in tasks connected with perception. So this is where most of the action has been over the last 15 years or so, in building machines that can do automated translation, that can do speech recognition, that can do facial recognition, driverless car technology, as we've seen a previous speaker today. All of these are narrow, very specific tasks that we're trying to get machines to do. And that's where the real action is on AI. And so while I think society may be affected by general AI at some point in the future, I think that's sometime in the future. It's not going to affect us in the next 30 years. So how will AI develop? I think AI will develop, and the way that we will encounter AI in our everyday lives is very much like the way that we started to encounter computers in our everyday lives from the late 1970s. And in just the same way that we saw initially, there were some that computers were essentially isolated beasts that you didn't encounter very often. Microprocessor technology made it possible to embed computer processing power everywhere. And now, for example, if you get into your car, there will be dozens of microprocessors in there in your vehicle, which are monitoring the engine and monitoring your fuel efficiency and running your entertainment system and so on. And so just as microprocessor technology became embedded everywhere, I would anticipate that AI will become embedded everywhere in our environment. And what that's going to do is it's going to make us smarter, it's going to make us more efficient, it's going to make us healthier. It's going to make possible a whole range of new goods and services and leisure pastimes, which we can't imagine right now, just in the same way that we couldn't have imagined all of the various different goods and services and leisure pastimes that were created by microprocessor technology. And more than that, of course, AI is going to be embedded ever more in existing goods and services and leisure pastimes. And so it's going to change them. And so the way that we're going to encounter AI is that everywhere we have to make a decision, there will be AI embedded. Everywhere where we have to make a decision, AI will be embedded. And those decisions are decisions, not just conscious, deliberate decisions, the kind of decisions that we sit and think about over time, but the kind of very quick, responsive decisions that we make every moment through our lives. And AI is going to help us make those decisions much, much, much more efficiently. So AI is happening, but it won't be like the movies. So in the remainder of this talk, what I'm going to talk about is survey 3 ways in which AI is going to affect the nature of work. How is it going to change work? Is it going to make people redundant on a large scale, for example? I'm going to talk about the way that AI is going to change the way that we interact with money. It's going to have dramatic influence on the way that we interact with money, but what will that mean for us? What will that mean for consumers? And finally, I'll talk about the way that AI will change education. And to close, broadly speaking, I think all of those things are positive, and I'll explain why I think they're positive in the talk, but there are challenges ahead for society. So I'm also going to talk about issues of bias, issues of alienation, and other areas where AI is going to present challenges for society. So first then, what I want to talk about is AI and work. So the first thing to say is that concerns about AI and unemployment, about AI systems making people redundant, are after the fear of killer robots and the singularity. Probably fears about AI making people redundant are the most widespread fears about artificial intelligence. So here is a typical headline from The Guardian, a newspaper in the United Kingdom. It said, "Robots will take our jobs. We better plan for it before it's too late." And that was a very typical article from the last few years. That one particularly appeared in 2018. So I've already mentioned the way that microprocessor technology affected society at the end of the 1970s, the beginning of the 1980s. And what happened then is cheap, small microprocessor technology made it possible to embed computer processing power into all sorts of different areas that were just unimaginable. They weren't economically or physically feasible previously. And the upshot of that is that there was large-scale unemployment, mostly of unskilled manual laborers working, for example, in factories. That was just computer automation. And the fear is, as AI becomes smarter, that AI will now take to the jobs of skilled workers. Okay, so whereas previous automation took the place of unskilled laborers, perhaps AI will start to take the roles of skilled laborers. And the debate in this area was precipitated by a 2013 report by some colleagues of mine, Carl Benedict Frey and Michael Osborne at the University of Oxford. And the headline from their report was that 47% of jobs in the United States are susceptible to automation in the near future. 47% of jobs. Now, if that worst case scenario came to pass, then that would mean unemployment on a previously unimagined scale. Not even a Great Recession in the 1930s put 47% of workers out. So that would be a cataclysmic impact for society. It would be the biggest change in the nature of the working world in the history of humankind. So what is the reality then? So how do we understand how AI is going to affect labor? Well, the first thing to say is that the automation of human labor is absolutely nothing new. If you go back to prehistory, the very first time that a plow was hooked up to an oxen or a horse, then that was the automation of human labor. Before humanity started to do that, it was people pulling the plows. And there are 2 immediate observations to make on the back of that. The first is that hooking an oxen or a horse up to a plow didn't make farmers redundant, it made them more productive farmers. The upshot of that move to the automation of human labor was that the farming job became a better job for the farmer, and farming became more productive. And so when we think about the effects of technology on employment, it's always important to keep hold of those 2 things. What it typically leads to is an increase in productivity. So we obviously don't have records of when the first oxen was hooked up to the first plough, but the first really big change in the automation of human labour came from the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution took place roughly between about 1760 and 1840. And there were a number of different factors which led to the Industrial Revolution, mainly in the United Kingdom. There were advances in steam engine technology, which made them more efficient and more reliable. There were advances in the development of cloth making machines, automated looms. And at the same time, there were some socio-economic factors. The British Empire at the time had connections to places like India, where they could sell cloth. They had connections to North America, where they could import the raw materials, the cotton from, to make those cloths. And it was all of those factors came together, which led to the Industrial Revolution. And what happened is that prior to the Industrial Revolution, most manufacturing had taken place in what were then called cottage industries. Basically very small scale manufacturing operations, very often based around people's homes or farms. And the Industrial Revolution changed that. The nature of manufacturing changed to factories, which employed many people. Those people typically working on very narrow tasks. They were one part of a much larger production process. Their jobs were typically highly repetitive. It took people out of the countryside, and there was a huge shift to living in cities at the time. And we're still familiar with those factory jobs in the present day. So that was a fundamental change in the nature of work, and until now, the most dramatic change in the nature of work in human history. And I say we still recognize those kind of factory roles in the present day. In the late 1970s and early 80s, as I've already mentioned, microprocessor technology did something similar. What it meant is that many of the roles in those factories, those unskilled, repetitive roles, which had previously been carried out by people, were suddenly amenable to automation by computers. And so we saw, again, another large-scale change in the nature of work. And roughly speaking, the level of skills that were amenable to automation began to rise. But once again, the wide-scale take-up of computer technology, microprocessor technology in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it made large numbers of people redundant. It put people out of work in the kinds of factories actually that the first industrial revolution had ushered in. But at the same time, it created wealth. It made products better, cheaper, more reliably, and it created wealth. Although the wealth that was created and the jobs that were created were not necessarily in the same places that they were lost. But the upshot of that was that in the end, wealth and jobs were created. So new technologies create wealth, and it's easy to forget that. For the first and second industrial revolutions, the first being the 1760 to 1840, the second being the late 1970s, early 1980s, ultimately led to better living conditions, more wealth, and so on. But that doesn't imply that that wealth was evenly divided. And it doesn't imply that the jobs that were created were in the same places that they were lost. But those new technologies created new products and services that couldn't have been imagined in the early 1970s, for example. And the expectation is actually that in the same way that hooking an oxen up to a plough freed farmers from dull and repetitive and exhausting jobs, we hope that AI will also free us from dull and repetitive and dangerous jobs and allow us to focus more on the kinds of roles which actually employ our human skills. But nevertheless, some skills, some jobs will be made redundant. So it's useful to think about which of those will be. So to turn that on its head, which jobs will be safe from AI automation? Well, the first thing to say is anything involving human social skills. Any role which requires you to understand people's beliefs, desires, emotions, their aspirations. Any role which requires you to do that is likely to be safe from automation, because we do not have, and we will not have anytime soon, machines which have the full range of human social skills that we all have. So what kinds of roles? Well, teachers. I'm going to talk about teaching specifically later on. Teaching is much more than just standing in front of a class and talking to that class. Doctors, all right, so a doctor is not just a repository of knowledge about diseases and symptoms, right? That's certainly an important part of the role, and a big part of training to be a doctor involves learning all of that stuff. But doctors have social skills, and to be a good doctor means deploying those social skills. Okay, so doctors have to be able to understand their patients down at the level of those patients' beliefs and their aspirations and their fears and their emotions. And when they're thinking, for example, of a treatment regime, they have to take into account, for example, how a particular person feels about a particular treatment regime and what treatment regime is likely to work with this individual. And then, of course, psychiatrists, you know, an extreme example of a job which requires understanding of people. So jobs that involve human social skills, I think, are going to be safe for the time being. Jobs involving manual dexterity. So if you've ever seen a carpenter at work or a plumber at work, they work with their hands. They have to do intricate tasks which require very complex dexterous maneuvering of physical objects in the real world. Okay, I mean, a plumber who has to get behind, your kitchen units to be able to fix a leak and so on. It's a very fiddly, difficult thing to do. So carpenters, plumbers, electricians, all of those kinds of roles which require a great deal of manual dexterity are likely to be safe, at least for the next 30 years or so. The current state of the art in robot hands is nothing like, nowhere near as good as human manual dexterity. So jobs that involve a lot of manual dexterity are going to be safe. Jobs involving creativity are being safe. So this obviously involves jobs in the arts. So, J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter, we're not likely to see a computer produce a work of art like Harry Potter anytime soon. So those roles will continue. In the media, filmmakers, those roles will continue. Music, we have computer programs that can make music, but actually it's not tremendously good. And while we might have computer programs that can make kind of listenable music, I don't see anytime soon having computer programs that can create music in the way that the Beatles or the Rolling Stones created music. So those roles are likely to be safe. Roles involving science. Science is creative, being able to create a new scientific hypothesis, to create a new scientific research direction. Those roles involve creativity, and so they are likely to be safe. And finally, jobs that involve personality. So a TV anchor person. I've seen demos of computer programs that aim to take on the same role as a TV anchor person. But they're hard to listen to for more than a minute or two. And why? Because they have no personality. It's clear that you're not dealing with a human being, and you don't engage in the same way with those computer programs that you would with a human anchor. However, against all of that background, teachers, doctors, psychiatrists, plumbers, carpenters and electricians, writers, filmmakers, and TV anchor people, that doesn't mean that they won't use AI. But just like the very first farmer who hooked up their plow to an oxen and became more productive, AI is going to enable those people to be more productive. And so the main role that I see AI taking for all of those people and for all of us is basically that of making us better at what we do, letting us focus in our roles on the kinds of activities which involve human creativity and human skills, specifically human skills. So what will your job look like in 20 years? Well, most of us these days work behind computers. A great deal of our role involves working behind a computer screen. Throughout the pandemic, of course, we've been doing that an awful lot more than we did previously. And that's going to continue. But behind the scenes, AI is going to be embedded everywhere. Every time you work through some workflow on a website, for example, completing a form and ticking a submit button, which I have to tell you takes up a great deal of my working life, we're going to see AI embedded there, and it's going to help us manage those workflows. It's going to, I hope, take away the dull, the repetitive stuff, the stuff that doesn't require me to do. Okay, so AI will be embedded everywhere in our working environment, and often we won't know that it's even there. So the analogy is that of the word processor. So when word processors came about in the late 1970s and early 80s, they did not replace secretaries. They just made them better, more efficient secretaries. AI will not replace secretaries. It will just make them better and more efficient secretaries. So let me move on then and talk about AI in finance. So AI and money. How is AI going to affect the world of money? And particularly, how are we going to perceive AI and money? And we can think about this in two respects. We can think about AI in its kind of customer-facing role, me as somebody who has bank accounts, who interacts with a bank as a customer, who has some income and who manages their money flows through those bank accounts, and then through the back office, where AI is used to automate and inform financial decisions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through those two different roles. So the most important role that I think AI is going to have is customer-facing software agents. So software agents are an old dream. In fact, I became involved in work on software agents in the late 1980s. That was what I first started working on. And the dream was that we would have software applications were not just the passive recipients of our instructions, waiting to be told what to do, which is at the moment, if you use Microsoft Word or PowerPoint or something, that's what basically happens. The software is the passive recipient of your instructions. But instead, we would have software which is an active assistant, something which is working with us actively on a particular task at hand. So software agents were originally proposed in the 1980s, but they've become a reality in the era of the smartphone. So Siri and Alexa and Cortana are all manifestations of that dream. They are all manifestations of that dream. As I say, the dream is that you have software which is not just waiting to be told what to do, but is actively working with you. And it's possible now, basically because smartphones are supercomputers. They're supercomputers that we carry in our pocket, that are seamlessly connected to the internet, that have access to our personal information. They know where we are. They very often know what we're doing at any given time, and all of that data enables these software agent technologies. So the dream is that what we will have is AI-powered personal financial managers, the software agent being realized in personal financial assistance. And the idea is that the software will work with you as an active assistant to manage your personal finances. And the dream is that what this is going to enable is that everybody has a personal financial assistant. I don't know about you, but I typically talk with people in my bank about once every year or once every 2 years, just to check, how things are going, or if I need a new loan to buy a car, or I need to remortgage my house or something like that. So my bank accounts, actually my finances get relatively little consideration. And I am no expert at finances. I find it very hard to judge different loans and the terms and conditions of different loans and so on, to make judgments about what are the best for me. So the dream is that everybody will have, in the form of a software agent, a personal financial assistant. So what is it going to be able to do? Well, one thing is it's going to be able to understand your spending habits. So AI is great at analyzing data streams, at classifying data streams, and making predictions from data streams. The last one, not as good as the first two, but analyzing data and classifying data, that's what AI is very, very good at. So it is very easy to imagine that in the next few years, what we're going to have is personal financial assistants that have access to our long-term spending records and that can monitor trends, and that can tell us, for example, the present rate you're going to go overdrawn on your bank on the 1st of July. You're spending twice as much on groceries this time as last year. The bank loan that you have is not the best one for you. So, of course, the value of AI-powered financial assistance is multiplied if they have access to information about people in similar circumstances. So, for example, an AI assistant that could say, do you realize that you're spending 25% more on average on entertainment than other people in a similar situation? Others in a similar position have twice as much savings as you have. Okay, so, and finally, the idea of AI as being a proactive financial manager. So we don't, most of us, proactively manage our mortgages, our loans, or our money. We tend to be very reactive. We tend to notice when we go overdrawn, but we're not on a day-by-day thinking about the best way to manage our money. So we choose a deal, a loan, for example, and then we stick with it, even if there are, in principle, better options coming along from the same company or from different company. So here there's a huge opportunity for AI. AI can continually scan for opportunities and use experience of past deals to learn that our loans and so on are in the best place possible. So this is proactive management of our finances, something that very few of us, in fact, have the time to be able to do. Because all this raises issues of trust. So to make any of this work, we need to trust the AI, which is managing our finances. And the big tipping point is when we go from the AI making suggestions to the AI actually taking control. So without our direct control, actually, for example, changing a loan that we have access to. And this requires that we trust. And there are several different dimensions to trust. The simplest is we have to trust that the software is good software, that the software doesn't have bugs, but also trust in the sense that the actions and advice that we're receiving is actually in our interest, that the agent really is working for us, that it's not working for the bank. Now, for banks and other similar organizations that want us to use their software agents, and we're beginning to see some of those now, this is a big hurdle. This is a big hurdle that people are often very reluctant to trust the advice that they're being given. There are obviously problems of security. How do we ensure that the agent is not going to be hacked? For example, that's a basic cybersecurity question. And if an AI system has access to my finances and has control, then that's clearly an issue that we need to be concerned about. But also there's a bigger issue of security, which is how can we be sure that the AI is smart enough not to be exploited? So it's not stupid AI that we're using. And then finally, the problem of personality. When we interact with a bank, when I talk to my bank manager, it's a human being. And that human being understands my various different concerns and my various different aspirations. How can we have machines that are able to do that? And if it doesn't, then it's just a cold, unfeeling machine. And I don't have any kind of relationship with cold, unfeeling machines. So if the bank is going to say, I'm sorry, but you can't afford a new car if you pay for Jenny's school fees, then the AI that tells you that needs to understand how you are going to take that news. There are various different aspects of AI in the financial back office, which I'll talk about previously. But just to re-emphasize then, what I foresee in the next decade or so is AI-powered software financial assistants that are going to help us proactively manage our finances in a way that for most of us just isn't possible at the moment. For banks and other similar organizations, there are various different ways that I think AI is going to be used. AI for managing credit ratings, for understanding credit ratings, AI for automated trading, and AI for fraud detection. So just as an example, AI for credit rating. And this is one of the most fundamental things that banks do, is when somebody wants a loan, when they're asked to borrow some money, the bank makes a judgment on whether this person is a good bet or not, whether this person is actually going to repay their loan or not. And the way this is typically done is by looking at information about the individual or the organization that's applying for the loan, their previous credit history, if they've been good with previous loans, their current income, how secure that income is, their current financial commitments in terms of mortgages and so on. And that's a data-driven process. That's involving looking at a piece of data and classifying that data based on previous experiences. Basically, the people that have been good previously with loans and those that have been bad. And It's a classic machine learning application. You train the system by showing it lots of examples of good and bad loans, and eventually the machine can classify an application as a good or bad bet. Now, from the point of view of banks, this is really nice. It appears to be quick and cheap and reliable, but is it reliable? Well, current AI is very fragile at the edges and can behave in very unpredictable ways. And so we're in very dangerous territory if we start handing over decisions to machines in that way. And more than that, there's the problem of bias. If the training data that's used to train this machine is biased, then those biases will be made evident in the machine learning program that ultimately makes the decision. For example, if you're basing your decisions on gender and ethnic origin and place of residence, then the AI system is going to start making judgments based on gender and ethnic origin and place of residence. And as well as that, the software can just be poorly engineered. We don't yet understand how to engineer robust, reliable, bias-free AI systems, and because of that, we can build AI programs which have biases. And this is a huge problem for naive applications of, for example, like credit rating. Similarly, the problem of transparency. If I'm denied a loan by my bank, I want an explanation. Why did you not give me this loan? And current AI technologies, neural networks in particular, famously are black boxes. A neural network just reduces to a huge list of numbers, and we have no way of being able to interpret those numbers and know what those numbers mean. So this is the black box problem for artificial intelligence. It can give you an answer, and maybe it gives you a good answer, but it can't tell you why it gave you that answer. And if we're going to use AI for example, for credit rating, then this is a very, very, very big problem. So AI has huge potential in finances, huge potential for changing the way that we manage our finances, enabling us to manage them smarter and more efficiently and more proactively. That's all to the good. And there are many applications for AI in the financial back office, but there are also many challenges. The last thing I want to talk about is AI and education. And the first thing I want to say, and I already hinted at this at the beginning, a teacher is not just somebody who stands at the front of a classroom and talks to the class. That's certainly part of what they do, but actually they are also learning mediators. They are mediating between the students who want to learn and a body of knowledge, and they're channeling that knowledge in the best way that they possibly can through to those students. They design and interpret learning programs and materials. Teachers are leaders and administrators and managers. They're also scholars and researchers and lifelong learners. Certainly, if you're in computer science, you never stop learning about computing. It's an ongoing process. They have an important role in the community in terms of a pastoral role and in terms of citizenship. They are respected members of the community. They are making judgments. They are assessors. So they're looking at students and making a judgment about how good or how bad a particular student is. And finally, they are specialists. We turn to them for advice about their subject area or their discipline. Now, in all of these different roles, AI has a place. Okay, so let's talk about some of them. So the first is AI systems have the possibility to adapt to particular circumstances. So teachers don't just lecture, they respond and adapt to students. But when I'm stood in front of a class of 100 students, as I typically do at the University of Oxford, I have limited room to be able to personalize my lectures to individuals within that group. AI has the capability to do that. It can learn a student's habits, their preferences and their weaknesses, and it can adapt delivery around those. But to be able to do that, we need large-scale data of engaging with students in order to help us to be able to build AI that can do that. So personalization and adaptation, AI tutoring systems that can adapt to individual students. AI that gives us insights into the learning process, so learning analytics. AI can give teachers insights into cohorts' performance, where their particular weaknesses are, where more effort is needed, where more explanation is needed, for example. Can give us predictive analytics based on historical data into likely outcomes, and it can do that in a hopefully unbiased way, although bear in mind all the comments that I made about bias earlier in the context of finance. can provide insights for students, real-time insights into students, again, that are hopefully free of bias into where they are in the learning process. It can potentially help with assessment, although I would be reluctant to move away from human-based assessment. I think it's important that we have humans in the assessment loop. But in principle, AI can help us assess our students in an unbiased way. Now, as educators, we distinguish between two types of assessment. There's summative assessment, which is basically the grade that somebody gets at the end of the course, and there is formative assessment. And these are the exercises, the tutorials that we set our students to help them learn the material that we are covering. And we as educators typically have limited capability in terms of resources to be able to give detailed formative feedback for students. AI has the potential to do that. I would certainly prefer that summative assessment was kept for human beings, but formative assessment, there's a lot of scope for AI to create exercises, unique exercises for students, and to give them feedback on their work. And if that's done right, it can reduce human bias and error. But bear in mind, all those comments are made about bias earlier. Self-directed learning. Creating bespoke learning programs for students. We don't remotely have the capability to do that at the moment in terms of resources, but AI-powered learning systems will enable students to assemble a unique curriculum, a unique syllabus, which is specifically tailored for them, to enable them to learn in a way which is ideal for that particular individual. Something we can't do at the moment just because of resources. Create new learning environments. So around about 2005 to 2010, we saw the emergence of massively open online courses, MOOCs, which made a certain level of education available to huge numbers of students who didn't have it previously. That was a new learning environment which was made possible by the internet and the World Wide Web. AI will create completely new learning environments, virtual environments that we can't even begin to imagine right now, which will be just as transformative as MOOCs. So, for example, one can imagine a history student who wants to study medieval England, who does it through virtual reality, where they actually go back through the virtual reality to inhabit medieval England as it actually was. Doing very faithful simulations of machines so that workers that use those machines can practice on them without the risk of causing damage. So like flight simulators, but AI-powered simulators, taking those to the next level. So new learning environments made possible by AI. Finally, efficient management and delivery. AI, together with smartphones and the internet, will be able to automate much of the management of courses. And actually, one of the effects of the pandemic has been that we've already started to see this being rolled out, which will relieve teachers of a lot of the routine and time-consuming bureaucracy. And as a consequence, it may not be the most glamorous application of AI, but reducing bureaucracy for teachers and allowing them to focus on what they do best, the thing where they can make most impact, seems to me to be tremendously valuable. Just briefly, just for 1 minute, a case study. This is Jill Watson. This is a system developed at Georgia Tech University, and it's the world's first artificially intelligent teaching assistant. And it's based on IBM's Watson AI platform. That's one of IBM's signature AI platforms. And she spends her days helping students in an online master's program connected with knowledge-based AI. And soon Jill's going to be able to answer about 40% of the 10,000 questions that students typically ask. And it's completely automated. And so the students, basically, it appears through their regular platform. It appears as if they were interacting with another human being through a chatbot type interface, but it's actually an AI program. And the really nice thing about this is that the vast majority of questions that students have are completely routine, and they don't require human brains to be able to answer them. They're questions like, when is assignment 1 due? And Jill gives acceptable responses about 97% of the time. And that, by what that does, the net effect of that is to free up the human teaching assistants and the human lecturers to focus on dealing with the other human beings, the things that are most important, where they as educators can add most value. And this is a quote by the developers of Jill Watson, and I think it's very important. It's not a question of taking human jobs away. It's a question of reaching those segments of the population that don't have human teachers. And those are very large segments of the population. And in the long term, I think this is the greatest promise for AI in education, not replacing teachers, but delivering education on a massive scale and enhancing current teachers, just as the very first plough being hooked up to the first oxen made a better farmer, AI enabling us to be better teachers. I just want final slide is just to briefly point at some societal challenges raised by AI. Through all of these applications, all of them, AI in work, AI in finance, AI in education, and AI in healthcare, AI in insurance, all of these different applications areas, the many societal applications all raise challenges around privacy. And the fundamental conundrum of AI at the moment is AI can work for you if you give it your data. AI can work for you if you give it your data. So in order to get AI to do wonderful things for you, you have to give it your data. Managing that going forward, what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable is something that we really haven't figured out yet as society. Fake news and altered reality. AI can create perfectly plausible fake news stories. What happens if we go on social media and there are far more fake news stories created by AI than real true stories? I've already touched on the issues of bias. They are absolutely embedded. If you're working with AI now, you absolutely need to think about issues of privacy and bias. Issues of diversity. What happens if all the AI that we use is created by men, or if it's created by white, male, college-educated individuals? That's a narrow demographic in terms of the global society. And the upshot is the danger is that we create male AI. And finally, we've talked about AI and work. What happens if AI is your boss? What happens if it monitors you throughout your entire working life? Every email you send, every keystroke on your computer typewriter is monitored by AI, and that AI is giving you feedback potentially, perhaps doing your annual appraisal, or perhaps even deciding whether you keep your job. That's going to be profoundly alienating for many individuals that are in those kinds of roles, and those are the things I think that society needs to be aware of. So at this point, I'm about done. Thank you very much for your attention. Apologies again for the problems at the beginning, but I hope I made up for it somewhat, at least in that talk, and I hope you found it interesting. I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Let's thank Professor Wooldridge for the nice talk. Let's take questions. Are there any questions on this talk on AI and the challenges of AI? Dr. Tevre?
Hello, Professor Michael. First of all, thank you very much. Maybe I should move here. The camera doesn't follow me. Does it see me?
Yeah. I think I see you, yes.
It's supposed to follow me, but somehow it's...
I can see you stood up.
Okay. I'll just sit down.
Okay. Now I can see your head. That's good.
Thank you for this interesting presentation. And it was very interesting to know the positive things that AI can bring to our life. But being a security person, I want to ask a question about the vulnerabilities of AI, especially if we automate everything, then the attacks on the AI itself and the fooling that you could talk about, foolish AI. So we have seen incidents where Tesla cars were crashed with signs being poisoned with Trojan images and so on. And what about the security and the safety of the AI? And who is going to be responsible if something goes wrong with the AI decision? Is it going to be the model designer? Is it going to be the developer? Is it going to be the data engineer? So how do you think that these things will be handled in the presence of adversaries? Who's going to be trying to use AI for their own purposes rather than the actual intent.
So I think, let me sort of take that question in sort of reverse order. I mean, I think the first most important thing to say is that any idea that we would be able to abdicate our responsibilities as, for example, as a car designer, for example, as a Tesla car designer, we can't blame the AI in the car for what goes wrong. The responsibility lies with the developers and in terms of the company who make that product available and warrant that it is safe to be used. In exactly the same way that if they developed a car with engines that that blew up, I mean, actually there are historically examples of that, or airline manufacturers that manufacture unsafe aircraft. They can't blame the aircraft, and just because it's using a neural net doesn't mean that you can shift your responsibility. So that responsibility will lie with the manufacturers. It will lie with the individuals who deploy the AI software. If you're a bank and you develop an AI software which makes biased decisions, you are responsible for that deployment, and I don't see that going away anytime soon. The idea that AI can make ethical judgments or moral judgments, I think that's a red herring. I don't think we should discuss that. It's people and organizations that I think need to be responsible and need to be ethical and need to be moral. The other part of your question about, which is basically a question about cybersecurity, I think is a very, very, very pertinent one. AI is software, it can be hacked. And there are, I mean, you might laugh, but actually, for example, robot vacuum cleaners, many of us use robot vacuum cleaners, Roombas and similar machines, and they can be hacked. And you might laugh, well, what does a robot vacuum cleaner do? Well, actually, contemporary robot vacuum cleaners, some of them have cameras. Some of them are connected to the internet. They can be hacked. They can look into your house. They can watch what's going on. So, these are actually real concerns. They know when somebody's in the house, for example. With autonomous vehicles, there are dangers that, vehicles can be hacked and used as weapons. And actually, if you were able to remotely control a Tesla or to embed a Trojan horse program into a Tesla, you could cause loss of life on a very large scale if you were a terrorist. So I think these are very important issues. You're absolutely right to highlight them. I don't think the AI community has any magic answers to them. I think it's a fundamental cybersecurity question. I think it's a very safe bet that issues of cybersecurity are not going to go away anytime soon. We're going to be struggling with this. If we come back in 30 years, we will still be able to report issues of cybersecurity and hacking. So it's going to be an issue that's going to be front and center, I think, for the foreseeable future. And the very last part of the question is about reliability of AI programs. And again, this is a very, very topical program. AI, particularly neural network programs, can go wrong in very unpredictable ways, and we don't have a good handle on when they go wrong, when they make dumb decisions. And they don't just make small dumb decisions. They make decisions that just seem completely weird decisions in some cases, where tiny changes to an input lead to hugely different decisions that are made by the neural network. We don't yet have a handle on how we can engineer neural networks in that kind of context safely, and so that, I think, is going to be that's going to be an issue going forward, and that's going to limit the deployment of AI basically to systems where we are comfortable about the decisions that are being made, in the sense that the consequences of those decisions are not too severe. But very good questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay. Okay. Shall we move on to the panel session?
10 minutes break.
10 minutes break. Okay. Yeah, we'll take a break of 10 minutes. After that, we'll continue with the panel session next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.